When will you ever be allowed to buy cigarettes again? Well, we don't know, and the state is not available to tell us just yet. But we try to make sense of the smokescreen tonight. Good evening, I'm Aldrin St-Pierre, and this is Unfiltered. Today, the continent celebrates Africa Day and does so under a cloud of COVID-19. And here in South Africa, today marks 60 days since the announcement of the national lockdown by President Cyril Ramaphosa. As we count the loss and looking back at what has been the impact on the coronavirus already on our ailing economy, remember that you can join the conversation and the discussion on our social media platforms using the hashtag SABC News Online and hashtag SABC News Unfiltered. And the question we're asking you this evening, are you satisfied with the move down lockdown levels given the surge of COVID-19 numbers? But first, we start here. A look at some of the stories that you can look forward to at SABC News' bulletin at 9 o'clock this evening on SABC 3. Basic Education Department says it's working with Eskom and other entities to ensure that schools are ready to commence with teaching and learning in time for the reopening next Monday. More than 1,500 schools around the country have been torched and vandalized since the lockdown in March.
The minister had a meeting this morning with MECs who did indicate that a lot of work was still continuing. Deliveries were taking place over the weekend, and principals would be in school to continue to take deliveries of such.
Support staff at the Helen Joseph Hospital have staged a protest calling for a section of the facility to be closed down for quarantine purposes. This is after several staff members of the unit have tested positive for COVID-19.
For staff members, they were tested and got positive. First thing, they started at casualty. Casualty was never closed and been sanitized. Stomach clinic, all the nurses are tested positive. It's closed but not sanitized. So we want all of us to be tested because we are afraid that we can get connected with those people.
Meanwhile, President Cyril Ramaphosa says the coronavirus pandemic has shown Africa's ability in working together to solve its own problems. Delivering the Africa Day speech as the African Union chairperson, he says Africa is firmly managing the global public health crisis.
We mark this Africa Day in the shadow of the coronavirus pandemic, which has swept across the world and left no part of our continent untouched.
Well, more on those stories with Shante Yankis later on this evening at 9 o'clock on SABC 3. But let's continue with the conversation this evening. And this is focusing on the decision by government to lift a decision previously taken that under level 3 cigarette sales would be allowed. You'd remember that post the announcement of government that we'll be moving into a lockdown on the 27th of March, the announcement was also that there will be a ban on the sale of cigarettes as well as the ban on alcohol, only to resume on level 3. But now there is been an about turn, but we're not too sure exactly what is behind this about turn. So we're going to try and make sense of it all as we speak to various guests later on this evening. Let's first start off with the social commentator as well as political analyst Kaya Mteto, who joins us. Rather, not Kaya Mteto, Kaya Stoller. Good evening, Kaya. Apologies for that and welcome to Unfiltered. Maybe you should try and sing here.
Good evening to the viewers. No, it's not going to happen on air. Good evening to everyone.
Good evening and welcome. How do we make sense of this particular U-turn? First of all, we were told that the sale of cigarettes will only start on level 3, and before we were told that under level 4, and there was a U-turn, and now there's an about turn here as well. How do we make sense of this?
So I think the one thing that we obviously need to make peace with is the fact that there was always a legitimate reason why alcohol and cigarettes were banned initially. And I think in relation to alcohol, it is simply the type of behavior that we know happens when people have had a bit to drink, particularly when they are drinking in spaces where they've gathered. So there was always a very legitimate reason for why the ban on alcohol was warranted, simply because you wanted to discourage mass gatherings of people who probably wouldn't observe the social distancing protocols anyway once they were drunk. In relation to cigarettes, it is a long-standing fact that obviously cigarette has got particular health risks. But of course, the difficulty here was the question of in banning cigarettes, was the government taking the view, firstly, that this escalated health risk where people's, lung capacities, for example, might be compromised by them smoking, was a thing that they wanted to mitigate against? Or was it simply on the basis of what the Minister of COGTA actually said, that unfortunately we do know that people do share cigarettes, and it is in the sharing of cigarettes that the risk existed. So we must understand that there was a legitimate reason at the inception to say, let us discourage these types of behavior. The problem comes in when there is then a distinction being drawn between the two, in relation to one being reintroduced and another not being reintroduced, because we now have to then ask the question of, well, if the risk profile was the same in that you wanted to discourage people sharing things that might be infected when one person passes a cigarette to the next person, is that still the risk? If it is still the risk, then of course the ban continues to be justified. But unfortunately, on the side of the alcohol, it's difficult to then imagine how you can articulate what has changed since then. Is it simply the question of, if people aren't doing it in places of gathering, then it's fine? Then the question must be, well, surely that was the case from inception. So if people can drink at home, they should have been able to do so at level 5. There's nothing unique about level 3 that then says, okay, drinking at home is different from drinking at home at level 5. So it's an ongoing conversation, but of course the government has to make a call one way or another.
Okay, Yusuf Abramji from Tax Justice South Africa also joins this conversation. Good evening, Yusuf, and welcome to Unfiltered. From where Tax Justice SA is standing, how do you guys make sense of this about turn from government?
Good evening, Andrew and Eldrin. We believe that the extension of the cigarette ban is a green light for the criminals to continue looting South Africa at the expense of decent citizens' lives. With their decision to extend the irrational and the unworkable tobacco ban, the National Command Council, Eldrin, has written a blank check for these criminals who are robbing South Africa of millions and millions of rands. And this billions of rands that has been lost to the fiscus could be used to buy much-needed ventilators. In fact, 2 billion rand can buy about 11,000 ventilators. They can pay the nurses' salaries. But at the end of the day, the criminals are smiling all the way to the banks. And we believe that the decision is completely irrational, and it makes absolutely no sense, especially under level 3, when the government suddenly decides to unban alcohol, and yet the Minister of Police is on record as saying the harms of alcohol, and suddenly a cigarette still remains banned, and the criminals are delighted, and I'm sure they're still busy celebrating this evening, because every hour that goes past, they're going to cash in big money with the illicit trade.
Kaya, give us a sense of the numbers in terms of the tax, how the coffers would be hit, how SARS would be hit. We've heard before that the numbers in terms of syntax run into the millions, 300 million, I think, with regards to cigarettes only in the past month that has gone by. But what does the numbers look like going forward? And the point that Yusuf also brings up is about the illicit sale, the illicit trade of cigarettes that's currently underway.
So in relation to the revenue, the only reference point we have at this stage is the number that was cited by the SARS commissioner in a press briefing he did a few weeks ago, where he said the combined effect of the alcohol ban and the cigarette ban was actually a loss in tax revenue of around 285 billion rand. So we were given a consolidated number. Now, how that manifests is that obviously we do know that in every single budget speech, when we talk about where to find money to run the country in the form of taxes, we know that sin taxes are always an easy, low-hanging fruit for government to go to, because people buy alcohol. So whether you add an additional cent or two here, there's still going to be sufficient people that buy that particular form of item of alcohol or cigarettes in order for them to enjoy it. So sin taxes are a lucrative source of revenue for the state. So we are definitely losing out on tax revenues. But there's also then the secondary question of us conflating a couple of issues. So for me, the question around illicit trades and illicit cigarettes is not a question of COVID, but it's a question of law enforcement. Because my question must be, well, if people are now engaging in illicit trade, firstly, it's a reflection on society itself, in that if you and I are now in a position to know which corner we must go to go and buy things that are illegal, that in itself is illegal conduct. That's the first thing that we need to deal with. So I'd be much more curious in us answering the question of how do we actually have a law law enforcement agency or a law enforcement regime that actually cuts down on all forms of illicit trade, not just within the tobacco sector, because for me, that is the fix that we need here. And the reason that becomes important is now that essentially people are saying there is a thriving illicit cigarettes market. If you then open up the formal market tomorrow, we know that the formal market is made up of people who have to comply with taxes and legislation. Yes. So one cigarette may cost 5 rand in the formal market, but now that the illicit market has been, allowed to thrive, that illicit market will still sell at 5 rand. It's difficult to imagine that people are now going to develop a conscience overnight and say, well, the true market has opened up, let me go and pay 5 rand instead of 4 rand. So again, you're still going to have to deal with the fact that there shouldn't be an illicit market to begin with, and it's not a COVID problem, it's a universal problem.
And Yusuf, it's very hard to dispute that particular point that Kaya is bringing forward.
No, Kaya makes a very good point. And yes, government on the cigarette trade alone is losing an estimated 35 million rand each and every day. We are on day 60 of the lockdown. That's about 2 billion rand. That money could have been used, but at the end of the day, every rand has now been spent on the illicit trade is going right into the pockets of these criminals. When we look at the prices of the cigarettes, for example, a packet of 20 that normally sells for about 30 or 35 rand, and yes, the illicit trade sells it for about 25 rand, has jumped up to 100, 150 rand. People are trading on Facebook. They're trading on Instagram. They are defying the lockdown by having additional movement by trying to look for cigarettes. We also got reports last week to say school children are now selling cigarettes. We know in some areas people are sharing cigarettes, and that is deadly, especially with the COVID virus. So no one, Eldrin, no one is disputing the fact that cigarettes have its health hazards, but in the absence of any proof from government that the correlation between COVID-19 and cigarettes, that whole argument will fall away. We know the President of the Republic of South Africa made an announcement some time ago that cigarettes will be sold. Within days, that particular decision was overtaken, and now suddenly the ban on cigarettes continues, and we know that the court challenge pending, and I wouldn't be surprised that other people will be going to court. The South African Informal Traders Alliance of about 1.4 million members, they've raised their concerns. The Business Against Crime have raised their concerns. I, as Vice President of Crime Stoppers International, the global authority on anonymous stoppers, we've written to the presidency already in April, not even the decency of a reply. We know the industry is battling. The Black Tobacco Association have made a noise. The Tobacco Transformation Alliance has raised its concern. The list goes on. But it seems to me government seems to be hooked on the fact that they don't want to ban tobacco. And we know from the media reports there's a lot of debate within Cabinet, and Cabinet is divided. But it doesn't really make sense when we have such an industry that's generating millions and billions of rands in taxes, that government suddenly decides that they want to keep it banned. It does raise the question, who's making money here, who is benefiting? And I can tell you now, the only people benefiting, Alrin, are the criminals.
We've invited BAT, and they said that they won't be part of the conversation until these new resolutions or regulations have been gazetted, Yusuf. But do you have any understanding whatsoever that at the time that they decided to drop the case against the state and not go the legal route anymore, whether or not there was an assurance given to them that under lockdown level 3, there would be the sale of cigarettes, as we've all known, and we could be moving into lockdown level 3 very soon?
Absolutely no idea. We don't represent BAT. We don't represent any tobacco company per se. Tax Justice South Africa is focusing on the illicit trade. We've raised our concerns about illicit alcohol. We've raised our concerns about the illicit textile industry, the fuel industry. So our mandate is to look at the illicit trade, look at counterfeiting, look at the fiscus losing money. That's a question that BAT and its lawyers probably will have to answer. Okay.
Kaya, from your end, do you have any understanding at all, or have you ever tried to make sense of why BAT dropped its case against the state?
Look, I mean, it's speculation, and BAT are the only ones that can tell us exactly what happened. But my thinking was that they probably had the hope that, with the impending shift from one level to the next, there would be an opportunity for the government to re-engage the question. Because remember, we must make peace with the fact that it was the president who made the problem, who created the problem initially by making that premature announcement while we're still contemplating stage 4 of saying that cigarettes would then be welcome, only for the regulations to then come out and say something in the alternative. So it was the president's fault that we ended up with that particular issue. So of course, if you had heard that it is possible in level 4, you'd be thinking, well, if it was contemplated in level 4, perhaps at level 3, there's a very strong chance that it will actually be implemented. So that was probably the mistake that they made in simply assuming that if you thought about it at level 4, you'll definitely do it at level 3. The government was not obviously obliged to do so, and they've obviously decided not to do it.
Okay, so after the break, we will be joined by at least one association that is steadfast that they are taking the government to court over the ban of the sale of cigarettes, and that is the Free Trade Independent Tobacco Association. We'll be having this conversation with them as well, and what this means, considering that right now we do not know when the sale of cigarettes will be allowed again.
There's no way that we can separate alcohol and tobacco. The most likelihood, I think about over 75%, it is proven that those that are using alcohol are equally using tobacco. So therefore, they will be able to source it in whatever way.
And we continue our conversation around the ban of the sale of cigarettes, which has now been extended into level 3. The president announced last night that the entire country is going into level 3. And as expected from the initial draft that was shared with the country on the various levels, that under level 3, the sale of alcohol as well as the sale of cigarettes will resume. But last night we heard from the president that due to health reasons, the decision was taken that there will not be any sale of cigarettes that happen under lockdown level 3. However, though, we still don't know what this means for lockdown level 2 or lockdown level 1. And we're still joined by accountant as well as analyst Kaya Stole. Kaya, your understanding or your view, for instance, about what the impact of something like this would be if the entire country doesn't know when there will be the sale of cigarettes?
Look, I think obviously I'm fortunate in that I do not smoke, so perhaps me understanding what drives people to become addicted and how long it takes people to get off or win themselves of that addiction is a bit limited. But I do think that a lot of people that I've spoken to who speak about the fact that for them, they're so used to cigarettes, it's difficult for them to stop doing it overnight. They are going to try and find alternative ways of sourcing those form of cigarettes. And that is something that we have to sort of deal with as a country, which is to say, look, the spirit of the rules makes sense because you're simply saying that we're dealing with a particular virus, and this particular virus has got particular effects for people who've got compromised respiratory systems. That's a very legitimate healthcare explanation for why we've ended up here. But then the problem is in a country where you now know that our enforcement, law enforcement is so weak, people are going to do it anyway, then you have to be able to try and figure out how do we then manage the risk that we know is simply now going to be taken away from the formal structures onto the informal structures, because let's face it, it simply means that the healthcare consequences are still actually going to exist. And unfortunately, the also unintended consequence is that when they now engage in the informal market, it is where the prices are much more expensive. So if you thought that people were sharing cigarettes when they're buying them from the formal market at 5 Rand a packet of cigarettes, for example, you can imagine what the situation looks like at 150 Rand per packet when clearly not enough people can afford it, and the sharing then becomes far more endemic.
What does this also then mean for the trust levels between the state as well as the populace, that the government seemed to have gotten the buy-in of the people when the announcement was made by the president that we're moving into a lockdown? And of course, then there was the blunder that you mentioned earlier on as well, where the president made the announcement that the sale of cigarettes will be allowed under level 4. And then there was an about turn. And now again, we find ourselves in a similar situation where there was a promise that was made, but that promise hasn't been kept.
Look, again, I don't know if somebody can say that the state made a promise to say that guaranteed at level 3 or any level, we're going to give you access to cigarettes. But I think the key issue here is that we're now going to start seeing a lot of people saying, hey, guys, we are unable to then trust you on the steps forward when you make particular pronouncements or you make particular, you give us particular hints only for you to come out in the regulations and say something completely different. So this one particular case has obviously not helped the government, because people want to be able to have faith in when the president says, okay, this is where we're going, then people should be able to link what he says to what the regulations eventually say, because you still want the buy-in of society to say, look, we've made sacrifices, we've committed to this process, so therefore, if at least we know what the thinking is, we are going to follow it. So I think this particular cigarettes episode hasn't helped in that particular regard, and we're hoping that it's not replicated in another form.
What does this also mean then for Minister Tito Mboweni, who had said that he tried to debate this issue within cabinet and he was defeated initially, as he told Parliament? Does this also then just mean that that's it, that the Minister of Finance was defeated yet again?
The problem, of course, with the Minister of Finance tweeting is that it doesn't have the same gravitas as a formal pronouncement by the state saying, look, this is what we've looked into, so therefore this is what the final statement is. So for him to say that, to drop us these cryptic hints on Twitter that I was defeated and I had to swallow stones, I tend to take that with a pinch of salt, because he could have been referring to another matter altogether that was discussed in cabinet. But of course, because he keeps dropping hints, we then have to speculate it must be this one matter that we ourselves are talking about. But there's a reason cabinet conversations are confidential, because it could have been the nuclear deal for all we know. But I do think that obviously for him, this is not something that is leaving him in a good light, because you are thinking within the cabinet structure, he is the one that is in charge of advancing the issue around the economic consequences. Then you've got the other ministers who are experts in the healthcare sector, who are then responsible for advancing the conversation around the healthcare consequences. It's the question of the balance, and the balance must then be, we understand the healthcare consequences, we understand the economic consequences, but what is the right balance that gets the best outcomes for society, not just the healthcare outcomes, but also the economic outcomes. And if our finance minister is unable to win an argument of that nature, we've got bigger problems as a country, don't we?
And let's discuss what those bigger problems are just after this break.
It was important that we consult as widely as possible. These consultations have been both necessary and worthwhile in that we received several constructive suggestions. These suggestions have enriched the thinking in government, providing a direct view of the challenges that our people in different constituencies confront. Cabinet has determined that the alert level for the whole country should be lowered from level 4 to level 3, with effect from the 1st of June 2020.
Well, there you have that announcement from the President yesterday. So now we're going to speak to Dr. Harry Moultrie, who's a senior medical epidemiologist at the National Institute for Communicable Diseases. Dr. David, good morning. Dr. Harry, good evening, rather, and welcome to Unfiltered. Can you bring us into government's confidence, really, about when the President says the reason around the continuing or extending the ban on the sale of cigarettes is because of health reasons? What would be these reasons that were not there before?
Hi, Alden. That decision-making has not been part of what I've been dealing with. My role has been to deal with the modelling of the epidemic and the trajectory in South Africa. I haven't been specifically requested or been part of the decision-making regarding the government ban on cigarettes.
Mm-hmm. And then in terms of the general infections that we know in relation, or the health concerns in relation to cigarettes?
The jury is still out on that. And I think that there's a lot of very early publications which might later get proved to be wrong. Mm-hmm. There are quite a lot of environmental ecological studies which have been trying to make the point that the proportion of smokers who are cases admitted to hospital.
Oh, shucks, we seem to have lost him there. Well, we tried to get a hold of him again, as we've indicated that the President making the announcement last night that we all move into level 3. However, though, the sale of cigarettes will not be allowed under level 3 as we had initially thought it would be, due to, if you look for instance at the different levels that were announced by government from level 5 all the way to level 1 as well, which industries will be allowed to resume, what will be on sale and so forth. And now there's been a change of heart around the sale of cigarettes. But we continue the conversation on our SABC News channel. To our SABC 3 viewers, it's a goodbye for now. Okay, Kaya, are you still with us?
I've received
Conversation around the modelling, and we'll try to get Dr. Harry back again. In terms of understanding how the modelling works, do you find that there's still some divisions within even the medical fraternity around how the government is going about its modelling? And of course, now we've seen from the opposition party taking the state to court.
No. When it comes to modeling, I'm completely clueless about those. But I think obviously what we are hoping is happening there is that the people that are, contributing to the conversation around trying to predict and estimate what the peak is going to be and what the number of resources that are going to be required in order to get us through that peak are going to be, are people that are open to sort of understanding exactly the need for ensuring that that process has the type of integrity, because it really so much hinges on them getting it right and us getting it right. So I do hope that the people that are assisting the state with the various modeling processes are able to do so from a place of very well informed place, because we are relying so much on them in order for us to be able to figure out what to do next in order to manage this pandemic.
Yeah. Okay, let's try Dr. Harry again. Dr. Harry, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Aldrin. Am I back?
Yes, you are. In terms of the modelling, what is it that you take into consideration before moving into a level 3, for instance, or even moving back to a level 5?
Okay, I think that the thing that needs to be clear is that the decisions of the levels are not necessarily directly dependent on the modelling. As a modelling consortium, we are providing decision support to National Department of Health and other branches of government of the likely trajectory of the epidemic given certain assumptions. Whether those assumptions turn out to be right or not, we'll find out. But the actual decision about levels and lockdowns is a more complex issue. We, as a country, are faced with rising case numbers of coronavirus, and yet we have a need, a requirement from a socioeconomic perspective, from a livelihoods perspective, to be easing the lockdowns. So I suppose that puts us in a rather difficult position as a country, and requires that all individuals are going to have to work together to try and limit the transmission of the virus.
Because at the same time, as you speak about the socio-economic impact of the lockdown, you, on the other end, have to speak about the concerns and the anxieties that some people have, also in terms of returning back to work.
That's right. So as people have more contacts with other people, their risk of acquiring or transmitting the disease to others increases. And it's important that we all are aware of those risks. I think that we've got to take a more nuanced approach to this, Aldrin. Under the early days of the HIV epidemic, there was a focus on abstinence, of trying to get to zero risk. Now, I think our lessons from HIV and other places have become clear that we need a more nuanced approach to communicating risk and addressing risk in our society. A lockdown is not sustainable forever, and nor is it necessarily an appropriate response for a long-term response to coronavirus. So, what's necessary is to provide adequate information to the public about where we think this epidemic is going, but also to communicate the need to take a nuanced approach to risk reduction. It's not impossible for all of us to reduce our risk to zero, but we can take steps to reduce our risk, whether it be in our workplaces, whether it be in our schools or whether it be in our social environments.
And then how do you deal with trying to get the buy-in of the people?
I think public trust is, quite frankly, the single most important commodity that government has at the moment. And I think we've got to communicate with honesty. We've got to communicate with uncertainty. We don't necessarily have all the answers. It's a new virus, a new...
Oh, shucks, we lost him there again. We're going to try and get a hold of Dr. Harry again. Unfortunately, that's what happens when you deal with live broadcasting. But in the meantime, we still have Kaya Stole on the line. Kaya, what do you think some of the obstacles lie for the state heading into a level 3?
Look, I think obviously the first and foremost issue is whether citizens on their own have understood over the past 60 days just exactly what is at stake here. Because for me, the ideal situation is for no one to need the government to give you a reminder. They've given you 60 days of lockdown to show us that actually there is a problem out here. So you're hoping that even on Monday, when the government says we are now in a different level, this doesn't lead to, undesirable behavior where suddenly people think that the pandemic is over. We should still be able to see people observing the same type of, defensive or conservative behavior that we've been seeing over the past couple of weeks, where people understood the risk that emanates when you go to public spaces, when you go and visit areas where other people whose health history you are completely unaware of may have been. So I'm hoping that a lot of us have learned that actually until somebody comes out and says it's all over, we should actually take the lessons of the past 60 days and make them and put them into our daily habits. It should be who we are, it should be how we behave, it should be how we understand that we are taking individual attention or individual responsibility for obviously managing our own exposure. So I'm hoping that that's what has happened. So the big issue is, firstly, we must take responsibility. But of course, for the state itself, remember the state is the one that unfortunately a lot of people are going to blame if something goes wrong. So the state, as my other colleague just said, its primary information, its primary currency is going to be information. So they need to be able to articulate that when we do open this public arena, whether it's a school, whether it's a university, this is what we've put in place, this is how far we can go. A lot of the success depends on the individuals that engage in that space to then also be able to take responsibility for them managing how they interact with each other within those particular spaces. So the big challenge for the government is to simply just keep communicating and keep reminding people that we are still in the middle of a pandemic. We've simply opened up some parts of human mobility, not because the pandemic is over, but because the lockdown in the long run is obviously not desirable and not sustainable anyway.
Okay, so when we come back, I'd love us to touch a bit on what this means in terms of the economy and industries that have opened since the 1st of May as we moved into level 4, some companies that have reopened, and we've seen now in the mining sector as well, the number of infections have increased. What does this mean for doing business in the country, especially considering that when you lose one member, it has an impact on your operations? Just after this.
Personally, I would prefer the unban of the product to servicing the need of fairness, which can be accompanied with much debate.
They could have put restrictions in place for people as they've done with other things. So I think that the government needs to unban both tobacco and alcohol, because currently they are being sold illegally. And the government has a loss of revenue in terms of taxes as well.
And we still continue our conversation as the country moves into level 3, as the president has indicated, from the 1st of June. The president also saying that there are some areas that will be moving into different levels. So while the country moves into into level 3, there are some areas that will remain probably at a level 4, and some may just escalate to a level 5. Let's just quickly bring into the conversation Dr. Harry again. Dr. Harry, in terms of the modelling and when we decide on the different levels, and I know that you say that you don't really work on the different levels, how should the nation understand a different area moving into a different alert level, and also the high risk within those areas? Hi, Dr. Harry. Dr. Harry, can you hear me? Okay, let's try Dr. Harry again, because this is a very important conversation to be had. If you consider that you do have different provinces, probably that could move into different areas at the moment as it stands, the Western Cape having the highest numbers of cases. And remember yesterday with the President making his announcement mentioning some areas within the Western Cape that are considered to be a hotspot. Gauteng is indicating that although they have been mentioned on the list as 3 metros in the province that are considered to be hotspots, Gauteng as a province will be moving into the various different levels in terms of moving to the various different levels instead of having various districts moving into different levels. They said that that will just be too problematic for a province like Gauteng, which is a small province but has a high number in terms of the population concentration that is huge here in this province. And also if you consider that Gauteng is considered to be the economic hub and the 7th biggest GDP on the continent. We still have Kaya Stole on the line. Kaya, the point that I made earlier on was that considering that from the 1st of June we move into level 3, of course, a number of school children who will be heading back to school, grade 7s as well as the grade 12s. How do we understand then the number of infections? If you look, for instance, as what's happening at Anglo Gold in Carltonville, an increase in the number of infections there, and now a call from the union saying shut it down. Can we really have such a response to individual companies?
Yeah, it's difficult. And again, remember, we're all operating in uncharted territory. And I think what we saw with some of the sectors that were opened up a bit earlier in relation to the mining sector, for example, of course, we knew that this was a form of a gamble. And the gamble still starts from the fact that it is possible that you and I are sitting here today completely healthy as far as we understand our bodies, only because the disease takes quite a while for it to become visible. So you're going to have the situation where a lot of people are going to pass whatever screening test that you might put up there, only for us to discover a week down the line that they already were infected. It is definitely an ongoing problem. But I think also when we now start talking about schools and universities, for example, the government had to take a view of saying, okay, is there a point in time where we think that the long-term costs of us retaining the status quo of not opening up these institutions is something that we can no longer bear as a state? And I think obviously if you think, for example, about grade 7 students and grade 12 students, if they're unable to complete the academic year, it would have long-term implications on the system at large. It will result in a bottleneck at the beginning of next year. So I think that that part might actually be an educated gamble by the state to say, well, surely within a particular school, we should be able to say if only one group is coming back, we'll be able to meet as many of the social distancing protocols as possible. But again, it is something that a decision has to be taken on. And at this stage, the state has said, let us try this. But the state has been very clear in that if something comes up that indicates that perhaps the decision was premature or the decision was wrong, they are not immune to the idea of saying, let us backtrack and actually revert back to where we were. So I think it's important for us to understand that at some point in time, difficult decisions have to be made. And this is one such instance. And in this case, we are dealing with an extraordinary crisis. And the best we can do is try and support the state in relation to the measures that are well explained, well articulated, and are rational.
What would you say are some of the things that businesses that would be allowed to reopen again under level 3 should be taking into consideration, considering, of course, as well that you've had, for instance, you've had the restaurants, for instance, that some arguing and saying that there's no need for us to be opening, considering that we are not allowing people to come and make their purchase. All that is allowed now at the moment is, for instance, you have Uber Eats, you have the deliveries that are taking place, as well as the takeaways.
Yeah, I think the difficult and perhaps the unique issue around the hospitality sector is we now know that most of their margins are actually generated when people can come into a restaurant and then sit and either have an extended meal or supplement that meal with drinks. That's where really they tend to make their profits. In a model where you simply say to them, you must only be able to sell on a takeaway basis, a lot of them quite simply will not be able to operate under that model. It quite simply doesn't make economic sense for them to do so. Now, of course, this is not without consequence, because the consequences are the people that are working in that hospitality sector are probably going to be the last people that get onboarded into the new economy, whatever the new economy emerges like after this particular pandemic. And that is definitely a tragedy that we as a country are going to have to try find a way to deal with going forward. And I think also for other businesses that are going to be allowed to be open, I think at no point in time has business actually ever had to subscribe to a particular universal social compact like they have to do now, because the very first requirement should be for any business to explain how they actually have in place the type of measures and the type of protocols that would ensure that if 10 people walk in this morning without an infection, by the end of the day we still have 10 people walking out without an infection. It would mean that for a lot of the things that we used to take granted, for example, the business has to take responsibility for saying this needs to be done differently. It would mean that those individuals that we usually used to ignore, which are the occupational health and safety captains or the safety champions of each institution, they now become quite important, because now we have to understand that we are dealing with the healthcare crisis. Everyone has got the responsibility, but of course the company that takes the decision that they want to reopen shares a greater burden of this responsibility, because they are saying to me, come to work, we've made it safe for you to be able to operate, and if something goes wrong, the first thing I will do instinctively is to say, well, you are the ones that sent me to my deathbed by forcing me to come into a place that wasn't well protected. So the responsibility on business is enormous.
Okay, and Dr. Harry, what would you say the responsibility on business is?
I think it's important that we try and find a reasonable balance between what is practical and feasible and what reduces the risk of transmission within business environments, in order to both protect the employees and the staff. I think that we have to try and take a more balanced, risk-adjusted approach, and I think that there are areas of this country where there are currently very few cases, and we should be able to open up those areas far more rapidly, and including potentially bars and restaurants and service industries. There are other areas of the country where, because we face increasing pressure on the healthcare service and system, such as in Cape Town and the Western Cape, that we need to take stronger measures as both business and government and individuals to try and reduce transmission, to delay and decrease the extent of the overwhelming of the healthcare service and system. So I think businesses need to really try and take a careful look at their risk, and individuals need to take a careful look at their risk, and we need to take appropriate measures to protect our staff and our employees and customers.
Okay. Just in conclusion, Dr. Moultrie, before we go to an ad break, in terms of the different levels and the different regions moving into different levels, do you have an understanding of how exactly it will work?
There are strategic documents in place that are being decided through the National Department of Health, which are agreeing the metrics of how those levels will be determined and decided. I think it's important to note that from my personal perspective, that one has to integrate multiple different sources of information in making these decisions. That a single hard line threshold or a metric is not going to be appropriate. We have to take into account the growth rate of the epidemic within an area. We have to take into account the health system capacity, how full it is. We have to take into account the socioeconomic status of the community in which we're talking about. And these then become judgment calls. In my view, I battle to see a single hard threshold that says if you've got an epidemic trajectory of this, then you can open up to level 2, and if it's this, it's level 3.
Yeah. Okay. And we continue to take your views. You can send us a tweet or you can go to our various social media platforms using the hashtag SABC News Unfiltered or SABC News Online. We conclude our conversation just after this.
Moving to alert level 3 marks a significant shift in our approach to the pandemic. This will result in the opening up of the economy and the removal of a number of restrictions on the movement of people, while significantly expanding and intensifying our public health interventions. The curfew on the movement of people will be lifted. Alcohol will be sold for home consumption only under strict conditions on specified days and for limited hours. The sale of tobacco products will remain prohibited in alert level 3 due to the health risks associated with smoking.
Well, we're now joined by Snenhlanhla Mnguni, who is the chairperson of the Fair Trade Independent Tobacco Association. Snenhlanhla, good evening and welcome to Unfiltered. Just a quick reaction from your organization's side. Were you at all shocked or did you expect this?
Look, we somewhat expected the announcement by the president. As we all know, the news was leaked in newspaper publications. So it didn't come as a surprise, but be that as it may, we are disappointed by the announcement by the president, particularly in light of the fact that industry wasn't engaged in the same way that other industries were engaged. And further, we find it disappointing that the president announces that there will be a lifting of restrictions on a number of economic sectors. And many which, for instance, you would argue have adverse effects on one's health, such as alcohol, but then chooses to single out the tobacco industry for a continued ban. So we are a bit disappointed in the manner in which government has dealt with this issue, particularly in light of the fact that industry has not been engaged at all.
Okay. Do you know at this point when at least the sale of cigarettes would be allowed now?
Aldrin, your guess is as good as mine. At any of the given levels, that's the lockdown period, we have never been advised as to whether the cigarette ban was going to be lifted or not. Now, in as far as level 3, following the sort of shenanigans that transpired in relation to the lifting of the ban and then the retraction by government, we're hopeful that government must have been of the view at the time that there was merit to lifting the ban. Perhaps they retracted, which we have to accept, but we're of the view that definitely at level 3 they would lift the ban. And now it seems like that's not the case. And there were talks again from media reports that this will only transpire at level 1. This is obviously concerning, but as is common knowledge, we have decided to approach the courts.
Yes.
And this was in relation to the president's announcement on 23 April.
Will you now seek an amendment to what you're asking the court?
Well, there was a court order on the 12th of May when part A of application was heard, where it was ordered that the state would have to disclose the record of decision and any reasons, if any, by the 26th of May, which is tomorrow, and further that we would, by no later than the 29th of May, be afforded the opportunity to supplement our papers, which is what we're going to then do, and then the matter will be there after we sit down for hearing.
Have you received any documentation as yet from government?
As we currently speak here, we have received nothing. As I stated, the court order states that they have until close of business tomorrow to provide us with those documents. Now, our submission is that we requested these documents as far back as when we launched our application on the 4th of May. Now, we have up until now, some 3 weeks later, not received these documents, which documents we have always submitted should have been readily available.
Yeah.
Particularly taking into consideration the fact that government relied on these documents when making the decision to ban the sale of cigarettes.
Okay, so just in conclusion, of course there is this ban on the sale of cigarettes. However, we've seen that there is the illicit trade of cigarettes that is underway, and Yusuf Abramji spoke at length about it earlier on. From your end, do you guys know who these companies are that are selling cigarettes or making sure that cigarettes are smuggled through our borders?
Look, it's very difficult to pinpoint who is behind this. We know that by history, our borders have always been porous. There was an article recently by the Sunday Times which highlighted the issue in as far as the border between South Africa and Zimbabwe in Messina, where people were walking freely to and fro and smuggling cigarettes and at the time alcohol, because those were both prohibited. Now, what we're finding is that these criminal syndicates are sophisticated. We're even finding brands from as far afield as China and other Asian countries. So it's very difficult to pinpoint. Mm-hmm. We know historically these cigarettes have been coming from our neighboring countries, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and Zambia. So it is very difficult. Industry, together with government and law enforcement agencies, have over years tried to tackle this problem, but it is something that is proven to be problematic, and it has only grown tenfold now that we have this lockdown period where the legitimate manufacturers of the South African tobacco industry have not been able to participate as a result of the ban.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Snenhlanhla Mnguni, who is the chairperson of FITA. I'd like to thank all our guests who joined us this evening, including Dr. Harry Moultrie, who's a senior medical epidemiologist at the National Institute for Communicable Diseases. We also had Yusuf Abramji, the chairperson of Tax Justice for South Africa, as well as a political analyst accountant Kaya Stole, as part of this evening's conversation. And thank you so much for all your contributions. We've come to the end of this evening's program. See you again next week, same time, same place. Goodbye.